As we've seen, a lot of the work that you end up doing when working with the web server in Node and Express is the work that happens between the request and the response. And so there are a lot of scenarios that are very common that happen between that request, processing the HTTP request and giving an appropriate response. It would be awfully nice if there was an easy way to specify the things that should happen between there and even have common plugins for what should happen between the request and the response. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about with a very common example. This is static files and middleware. Big word alert. Middleware. Middleware basically means code or software that sits between two layers of software. So I have an overarching application, but between two layers of it, I have some middleware that does something for me. And the cool thing is that Express provides an easy way to plug in middleware in between the request and the response to handle certain requests, providing certain responses automatically, and to even have multiple levels of middleware, where a request and response is handled and then moved on to another piece of middleware that does something more, etc. All right, so let's take a look at how this happens and what is probably the most common example of Express middleware. A very common scenario might be that I need to handle files being downloaded. Remember, it's just an HTTP request, so I need to manually deal with every kind of request that comes in for things that make my application work. So, for example, if I have a CSS file, a style sheet file that defines what my application looks like on the internet in the browser, then the browser is going to request it. It's going to make an HTTP request to get that CSS file. And I don't want to manually deal with that. I just want whatever files, CSS files, image files, etc., that are sitting on the server, if they're requested in that URL, then they should just be hooked to and streamed automatically to the response. I don't want to have to manually respond to every file that I might put of that kind. That is to say, static files. Big word alert. Static, meaning not dynamic. In other words, files that aren't processed or generated by code in any way. For example, HTML, just regular old HTML, or CSS, or image files that are just uploaded to the server and are just sitting there. They're static files. But we still need to deliver them when they're requested via an HTTP request. Remember, the request doesn't somehow connect to the file. We're just getting the request, and the server has to decide what to do with it. So let's say I want to add some static files to my application. This way, I or a designer or anyone could just push these files into the application, and they'll just be properly downloaded. We won't have to deal with what happens between the request and the response. We'll add some middleware that will do it for us. We'll start by adding a new folder. Now, this could be anything you want to name it. It's very standard to name it public, where you sit your static files. Then I'll make a new file, let's say style.css. And in this file, I'll just change the font family the entire site uses. This is very standard, so I'll just change what's the font of anything inside the body tag in the HTML file. And then I want to use this style. So how am I going to make sure that this file can be downloaded when it's requested via an HTTP request? I'll use middleware. I'll say app.use. And it is basically what it sounds like. We'll use some middleware. And we'll first match a route. So we could say public here, or I could name it whatever I wanted, because I'm going to map a route to those files in the file system, so they don't have to match as far as names are concerned. So if there's an HTTP request for, let's say, assets/something, then I'll respond with some middleware. Built into Express is some middleware called static. I say express.static, and then say where to find the file physically. So I'll say the _ dir name plus /public. And this middleware will then, thanks to app.use, will say, well, every time we see /assets and then we see /some file, what I'll actually do is go find this full file path, public, that's where I decided to put them, and then look for that same file and stream the response back. And that's all I have to do. Any static file then I put inside the public folder would become available by doing /asset /something else. And I could make this /public, I could make this /whatever / and then the file name. So I'll choose assets. You could choose whatever you want, but it is standard for the files to actually sit in a folder called public. So let's add this quickly to our HTML. I'll do a link tag and an href, and I'll say assets /style.css. And a link tag can have a type, text /css, and a rel style sheet, and close it. And that's just a standard style sheet link tag. So the browser is going to download this HTML, see this link tag, and generate an HTTP request for my site /assets /style.css. That HTTP request will be handled by Node, and when it sees the /assets part, it will say, okay, anything after that, I will look for it in this folder. This is middleware between the request and the response, and it will respond by streaming back this file for me. All right, let's see if this works. So nodemon is running, and we'll go to localhost /3000. And hey, look at that. The font is different. The style sheet was downloaded successfully. So if I open up the developer tools, go to network, refresh so I see them, there was my request for the HTML, and then the browser saw the link tag and generated that second request for the style.css. And if I look, it requested it at the address of my site /assets /style.css. And Node caught that, saw the /assets in the URL, and said, let's pass it to that middleware. And the middleware said, okay, I'll look for this file in that public folder, because that's where we told it to look, and it streamed it back. And we got the file back in the browser. And so now I could put images, I could put subfolders, I could put other style sheets, I could put whatever I wanted in there that was purely static content, and any request Node would properly handle because I have the middleware installed for it. Make sense? Now, you might be wondering, can I make my own middleware? Absolutely. Because app.use just matches a route and then takes a function. Express.static, when you invoke this, returns a function which then handles the request and the response, what's in between there, and also a third parameter that we'll call next. So what this means is that whenever this route hits, this function will be executed, just like with my get method. And then I could do something. So let's say I console.log request URL, and then I'll grab the URL from the request. And then I'll say next. I'll invoke that. This is something that Express provides for middleware to the function that you give as the callback when the route is matched. What this means, and all it means, is that run the next middleware. If you think about it, these get methods are middleware. I'm capturing a request and doing something before the response is sent. So between the request layer and the response layer of Node and Express, I have something in between. I'm sitting in the middle. And so I can do whatever I want when that particular request comes in, and then say, keep on going. Call the next middleware that is in some way connected to this particular route. So let's try it. My app is still running, so I'll just refresh, and it still worked, but look, that other middleware ran. It caught that particular route, ran my middleware, and that third parameter it passed to me was a function that I was able to invoke, which caused the next middleware to run, which turned out to be my get method. So I could go, for example, to /API, and there at console.logged, and I could go to person/1, and at console.logged. So this idea of middleware and connecting middleware together is very powerful because it lets me build reusable ways of dealing with HTTP requests and responses. I can use other people's middleware, like Express's static middleware, to save me time. And I could do whatever I want with the request and the response, and I can specify it according to the route. And you can actually leave off the route when it comes to .use, and it will just happen for every request, no matter what the route. So you could have a logger, you could have something that deals especially with uploads or downloads or whatever the case is. And there's plenty of middleware out there for you to look at. And since we're talking about JavaScript code freely available, other people's code, other people's middleware for Express, where do you think ultimately you go to be able to install those things? NPM. Of course, the NPM registry. And while under the guide there's a Using Middleware section on the Express website, there's under Resources, Middleware, I have a nice list which connects to the GitHub repo, and each of the GitHub repos tell me how to install these middleware into my application. So for example, if I wanted to deal with cookies, there's one listed called cookie-parser, and there's other cookie ones we can use as well. I click that, it takes me to GitHub, and I can see how to install it in NPM and how to use it. Here's a simple example. I'm using it with Express. I use .use. I'm not specifying a route, so it would use it always. And so this middleware will take the request, the HTTP request, which incidentally includes cookies as a string separated by semicolons. And you're probably familiar with the idea of a cookie in your browser, a little piece of information stored on your browser. Well, that gets sent along for the ride with every HTTP request to a particular site, the cookie for that site. So this pulls that out of the HTTP request, that string, breaks it apart, and then adds it on as a .cookies property to the request, and then calls next, so that when you go to get the route, you can just grab the .cookies property and get all the values in the cookie. That way you might have some specific piece of information you stored in the cookie and need to get out that was over on the person's browser. And there's lots of other examples. There's body parser, compression. There's something very popular called Passport for authentication to make sure someone is properly logged in before you actually respond with the data, before you finish giving them the response. And it helps you to authenticate the person, that is, make sure they're logged in via their own username and password for your site, or via something called OAuth, which are things like logging in via Facebook or Twitter and other things. So there's lots of incredibly useful middleware out there. But when you hear the term middleware, you shouldn't be scared of it. The idea is simply that via NPM, you install some JavaScript code that deals with a standard Express request and an Express response, and that's Express middleware. Makes sense? It's in the middle, between those two. And that doesn't mean that you can't then have your own middleware or do something after the fact, because you can just keep going. The middleware can pass the requests and responses to each other down a chain and just keep on doing things until we're actually ready to send the response. So be familiar with the idea of middleware and try this for yourself. You'll see that it's incredibly powerful, and another reason why Express is so popular.